The wind cut through the glass corridors of Hartwell International Airport like a blade, carrying with it the promise of the worst blizzard the Northeast had seen in decades. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, snow fell in thick, merciless sheets, transforming the world into a white void where nothing existed beyond the immediate present. The last commercial flight had been grounded hours ago, leaving the terminal eerily quiet except for the howling wind that seemed to seep through every crack and crevice of the massive structure. Alexander Hartwell stood in his private office overlooking the main concourse, his hands clasped behind his back as he watched the storm rage. At 42, he commanded one of the largest transportation empires in the country, but tonight, even his wealth felt insignificant against nature's fury. His assistant had long since gone home, along with most of the staff, leaving only essential personnel and security to weather the storm. The intercom crackled to life. "Mr. Hartwell?" The voice belonged to Marcus Chen, his head of security. "Sir, we have a situation in Terminal C. You might want to come down here." Alexander frowned, pressing the response button. "What kind of situation, Marcus?" "It's difficult to explain over the radio, sir. Could you come down? We're near Gate 47. Something in Marcus's tone made Alexander reach for his coat. He'd known the man for 8 years, and Marcus Chen didn't rattle easily. Whatever had prompted this call was serious enough to warrant his personal attention, even in the middle of a blizzard. The elevator descended through the heart of his airport, past floors of offices, through the shopping levels, down to the main terminal. As the doors opened, Alexander was struck by how different his airport felt in the storm's grip. The usual bustle of travelers had been replaced by an almost cathedral-like quiet, broken only by the wind outside and the soft footsteps of a few remaining staff members. He found Marcus standing near a cluster of seats in a corner of Terminal C, his usually composed expression troubled. But it wasn't Marcus who captured Alexander's attention. It was the figure huddled in the corner seat, barely visible beneath layers of what appeared to be newspapers and a threadbare coat. "How long has she been here?" Alexander asked quietly, moving closer. "Security first noticed her around noon," Marcus replied, his voice low. "We thought she was a stranded passenger at first, but—" he gestured helplessly. "Sir, I don't think she has anywhere else to go." Alexander studied the young woman more carefully. Despite the layers of worn clothing and the way she'd curled into herself for warmth, he could see she was probably in her mid-20s, with auburn hair that caught the terminal's fluorescent lights. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and even in sleep, there was something fragile about her that made his chest tighten unexpectedly. "Have you spoken with her?" Alexander asked. Marcus shook his head. "We've been monitoring from a distance. Frank tried to approach her earlier when she was awake, but she got scared and moved to a different section. She's been here for hours, sir, just sitting. Sometimes she walks around, but she always comes back to the terminal." Alexander found himself studying the woman's face, noting the sharp angles of her cheekbones that spoke of hunger, the way her hands clutched the newspaper closer to her body for warmth. Something twisted in his stomach, an unfamiliar sensation that took him a moment to identify as protective anger. "The storm's not going to let up for hours," he said quietly, "possibly not until tomorrow afternoon." "I know, sir. That's why I called you. I wasn't sure what the protocol was for this kind of situation." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, watching the gentle rise and fall of the woman's breathing. Protocol, as if there was a manual for finding someone slowly freezing to death in your own building. As if wealth and power came with instructions for these moments when you encountered real human suffering up close and personal. "What's her name?" he asked. "We don't know. She hasn't spoken to anyone." The woman stirred slightly, and Alexander found himself holding his breath. Her eyes opened slowly, revealing irises the color of storm clouds, a deep gray-green that seemed to hold depths of experience far beyond her apparent age. For a moment she looked directly at him, and he felt something shift in his chest, as if the world had tilted on its axis without warning. Then she saw Marcus in his security uniform, and fear flashed across her features. She sat up quickly, pulling the newspapers closer around her shoulders, her entire body tensing as if preparing to run. "It's all right," Alexander said softly, stepping forward with his hands visible and open. "You're not in trouble." She looked between him and Marcus, her eyes wide and alert. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse, as if she hadn't used it in days. "I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was just trying to stay warm." The sound of her voice hit Alexander like a physical blow. There was education in her accent, intelligence in her phrasing, but underneath it all was a bone-deep exhaustion that spoke of too many nights like this one, too many hours spent searching for safe places to exist. "I know," he said gently. "We're not asking you to leave. I'm Alexander Hartwell. This is my airport." Something flickered across her expression. Surprise, maybe, or wariness. "Your airport?" "Yes?" He moved slowly closer, noting how she tracked his every movement. "And you're welcome to stay as long as you need to. But I'm concerned about you being comfortable. It's going to get colder tonight, and this terminal isn't heated as well as other parts of the building." She stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether this was some kind of trap. "Why do you care?" The question was simple, direct, and it stopped Alexander cold. Why did he care? He'd built his fortune by making calculated decisions, by weighing costs and benefits, by maintaining emotional distance from problems that couldn't be solved with money or strategy. But looking at this young woman, seeing the way she held herself with dignity despite her circumstances, feeling the pull of something deeper than mere sympathy, he couldn't give her a rational answer because he didn't have one. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally. She studied his face for what felt like an eternity, and Alexander found himself hoping he passed whatever test she was conducting. Finally, she nodded slightly. "Okay." "What's your name?" he asked. "Emma," she said quietly. "Emma Sullivan." Emma, he tested the name, found it suited her somehow. "When did you last eat?" Color flooded her cheeks. "I'm fine." "That wasn't what I asked." She looked down at her hands, and Alexander noticed how carefully she folded the newspapers, as if they were precious silk instead of discarded waste. "Yesterday morning, I think. Maybe the day before. Time gets—" She trailed off, shrugging. Alexander felt that protective anger surge again, this time directed at a world that could allow someone like Emma to slip through its cracks. He turned to Marcus. "Could you ask Janet to prepare something from the executive dining room? Soup, sandwich, whatever she thinks would be appropriate." "Sir, the kitchen closed hours ago." "Then ask her to reopen it," Alexander said firmly, "and bring some blankets from the airline lounges, the good ones." Marcus nodded and headed off, speaking quietly into his radio. Alexander turned back to Emma, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You don't have to do this," she said. "I know I don't have to," he replied. "I want to." For the first time since he'd seen her, something that might have been a smile ghosted across her lips. Why? Again, that simple question that cut straight to the heart of things. Alexander found himself sitting down in the chair across from her, maintaining enough distance to avoid making her uncomfortable, but close enough to speak without raising his voice. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "How did you end up here?" The almost smile faded, and Emma's hands tightened on the newspapers. "That's a very long story." "We have time," Alexander said gently, "and I'm a good listener." She was quiet for so long that he began to think she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I used to be a teacher, elementary school, in Boston. I loved it, the kids, the energy, feeling like I was making a difference." Alexander waited, sensing there was more. "My fiancé, David, was a lawyer, successful, ambitious, everything I thought I wanted." Her laugh held no humor. "He was also a gambling addict, though I didn't know that until it was too late. He'd been using my credit, taking out loans in my name, mortgaging my apartment without telling me, when the debts came due." She stopped, staring out at the storm. Alexander found himself leaning forward slightly, drawn into her story despite himself. "I lost everything," she continued. "The apartment, my savings, even my job, when the scandal broke. David disappeared one night, left me with a mountain of debt, and a reputation in ruins. That was 8 months ago. 8 months? Alexander couldn't keep the shock from his voice. You've been homeless for 8 months? Emma nodded, still not meeting his eyes. I tried the shelters at first, but they're dangerous, especially for women. I tried staying with friends, but there's only so long you can impose on people's kindness before they start to resent you. Eventually, I realized that places like this, airports, train stations, 24-hour businesses, they're safer. Security cameras, guards, people around. Most of the time, if you're quiet and don't cause trouble, they'll let you stay for a while. The matter-of-fact way she described her survival strategy broke something inside Alexander's chest. Here was a woman who had clearly been educated, successful, loved, reduced to calculating the safest places to sleep rough. The injustice of it burned in his throat. Have you been able to find work? He asked. It's hard without an address, Emma said. And once potential employers start checking references, running background checks, she shrugged. The debt follows me everywhere. David made sure of that. Marcus returned carrying a tray, laden with food, and followed by a young woman Alexander recognized as Janet, one of the airport's hospitality supervisors. Janet's eyes widened when she saw Emma, but to her credit, she simply approached with a warm smile. I brought some vegetable soup and grilled cheese, Janet said, setting the tray down on the small table between the chairs. And some tea. I hope that's all right. The smell of food seemed to hit Emma like a physical force. Alexander watched her throat work as she swallowed, saw her hands shake slightly as she reached for the spoon. When she took the first sip of soup, her eyes closed, and a small sound escaped her that might have been relief or gratitude or simple pleasure. Thank you, she said to Janet, and the sincerity in her voice made the older woman's expression soften. Of course, dear, Janet replied. If you need anything else, just ask. As Emma ate, Alexander found himself studying her more closely. Beneath the grime and exhaustion, he could see traces of the woman she'd been before her world collapsed. Her table manners were impeccable, despite her obvious hunger. She ate slowly, carefully, as if she were forcing herself not to devour everything at once. Most tellingly, she kept glancing up at him, as if she couldn't quite believe this wasn't some elaborate joke or trap. Better? He asked when she'd finished about half the soup. Emma nodded, setting down her spoon. Much better. Thank you, all of you. She looked around at Marcus, Janet, and the other staff members who had quietly gathered at a respectful distance. This is more kindness than I've seen in a long time. You shouldn't have to be grateful for basic human decency, Alexander said, and the quiet intensity in his voice made Emma look at him sharply. But I am, she said simply, because in my experience, it's not nearly as basic as it should be. Marcus approached with an armload of blankets. These are from the first-class lounges, he said, offering them to Emma. They should be warmer than, well, the newspaper. Emma accepted the blankets with another quiet thank you, and Alexander watched as she wrapped one around her shoulders. The luxury fabric looked incongruous against her worn clothing, but it brought some color back to her pale cheeks. Emma, Alexander said carefully, I have to ask, do you have family? Anyone who might be worried about you? Something painful flickered across her face. My parents died in a car accident when I was in college. I don't have siblings. David was going to be my family. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself. I guess I'm what you'd call truly alone in the world. The phrase hit Alexander harder than it should have. He understood loneliness, though his was the kind that came from wealth and position rather than poverty and abandonment. Still, there was something about the way Emma said it, without self-pity, just stating a fact, that made him want to reach across the space between them and offer some kind of comfort. Instead, he said, You're not alone tonight. Emma looked at him for a long moment, and Alexander felt that strange, tilting sensation again, as if the world were rearranging itself around this moment, this woman, this unexpected connection forming in the middle of a blizzard. I should let you get back to whatever you were doing, Emma said finally. I'm sure you have important business to attend to, even in weather like this. Actually, Alexander said, surprising himself, I was just watching the storm, thinking, About what? He almost deflected the question with some generic response about business or the weather, but something about Emma's direct gaze made him tell the truth instead. About how isolated wealth can be. About how easy it is to lose touch with what really matters when you spend most of your time in boardrooms and private jets. Emma tilted her head, studying him. And what really matters? I'm not sure I knew before tonight, Alexander admitted, but I think it has something to do with moments like this, when you have the chance to help someone and you actually take it, instead of writing a check to a charity and calling it good. You give to charity? Millions a year, Alexander said, and there was something almost bitter in his voice. It's a tax write-off, a line item in the budget. I write the checks, pose for the photos, and go back to my life without ever thinking about the people the money is supposed to help. Emma was quiet for a moment, considering this. But you're here now, she said finally. You could have sent security to move me along, or just ignored the situation entirely. But you came down here yourself. You bought me dinner. That's not nothing. It feels like nothing compared to what you're going through. Don't do that, Emma said, and there was a sharpness in her voice that hadn't been there before. Don't diminish what you're doing because you think it's not enough. 8 months of living like this has taught me that small kindnesses can save someone's life. A security guard who looks the other way. A cashier who pretends not to notice when you use the bathroom to wash up. A billionaire who sees you as a person instead of a problem to be solved. The word billionaire hung in the air between them, and Alexander realized that she'd put together who he was. Hartwell International wasn't just an airport. It was the flagship of a transportation empire that included airlines, shipping companies, and logistics operations across 3 continents. His name was on magazine covers, business profile, society pages. He was used to people treating him differently once they knew his net worth. But Emma was still looking at him the same way she had before, as if his wealth was just another fact about him, no more significant than his eye color or height. How did you know? He asked. I'm homeless, not stupid, Emma said with a slight smile. I've been reading discarded newspapers for 8 months. Your name comes up fairly regularly in the business section. Besides, you have that look. What look? The look of someone who's used to being the most powerful person in any room he enters. Emma's expression softened. But also the look of someone who's not entirely comfortable with that power. Alexander stared at her, unsettled by how easily she'd read him. You're very observant. You learn to read people quickly when your safety depends on it, Emma said matter-of-factly. Body language, tone of voice, whether someone sees you as human or as a thing to be disposed of. It's a survival skill. The casual way she mentioned survival skills, as if they were just another part of her education, made Alexander's hands clench into fists. The idea that someone like Emma, intelligent, articulate, clearly educated, had been forced to develop such skills made him angrier than he'd been in years. This is wrong, he said suddenly. All of it. The fact that you're here, that you've been living like this for 8 months, that there are probably thousands of people just like you trying to survive, while people like me live in towers and write checks to feel better about ourselves. Emma regarded him carefully. What do you plan to do about it? The question caught him off guard. What was he planning to do? Offer her money? A job? Both seemed inadequate and potentially insulting. Emma had survived this long on her own. She clearly had strength and intelligence. What she lacked was opportunity, and that was something money alone couldn't always buy. I don't know, he said honestly, but I want to help. Really help, not just throw money at the problem. Why? Emma asked again, and Alexander was beginning to understand that this was her way, cutting straight to the heart of things, refusing to accept surface explanations. He thought about it seriously, trying to understand his own motivations. Was it guilt? Attraction? Some kind of savior complex? All of those things played a part, but underneath it all was something simpler and more profound. Because you matter, he said finally, because your life has value, and the fact that you're here, like this, is unacceptable. Because I have more resources than I could use in 10 lifetimes, and if I can't use them to help one person who's sitting right in front of me, then what's the point of having them at all? Emma was quiet for a long time, and Alexander found himself holding his breath, waiting for her response. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the terminal, there was a pocket of warmth and calm that felt separate from the rest of the world. "All right," Emma said finally, "but I have conditions." Alexander blinked. "Conditions?" "I'm not a charity case," Emma said firmly. "I'm not looking for a handout or a sugar daddy or someone to take care of me. I'm looking for a chance to take care of myself. If you want to help, it has to be on those terms." The strength in her voice, the pride despite her circumstances, hit Alexander like a revelation. This wasn't a woman who needed rescuing. This was a woman who needed an opportunity to rescue herself. "What kind of help would you accept?" he asked. Emma considered this, staring out at the storm. "A job," she said finally. "A real job, with real responsibilities and real pay. Somewhere I can use my education and experience. And an address. Some kind of housing situation that isn't charity, but isn't beyond my means to afford." "That can be arranged," Alexander said immediately. "Wait," Emma held up a hand. "I'm not finished. I want to earn these things. I don't want special treatment because you feel sorry for me or because you have some kind of guilt about wealth inequality. I want to be hired because I'm qualified and housed, because I can pay rent. Can you make that happen?" Alexander found himself smiling for the first time in what felt like days. "Yes," he said, "I can make that happen." "How?" "I own companies that employ thousands of people," Alexander said. "Education and logistics companies, training programs, consulting firms. With your background in education, there are probably a dozen positions you'd be qualified for. As for housing, I own residential properties throughout the city. I'm sure we can find something appropriate." Emma's eyes narrowed slightly. "At market rate?" "At whatever rate you can afford on your salary," Alexander said, "which will be determined by your qualifications and the position you take, not by your current circumstances." For the first time since he'd met her, Emma smiled. Really smiled, and the transformation was remarkable. Alexander caught a glimpse of who she must have been before David, before the debts, before 8 months of survival mode. She was beautiful, yes, but more than that. She was radiant with intelligence and hope, and a kind of fierce joy that no amount of hardship had been able to extinguish completely. "Okay," she said, "I accept your help, under those conditions." Alexander felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. "Good," he said. "We'll start tomorrow, after the storm clears." "What happens until then?" Emma asked. Alexander looked around the terminal, at the comfortable chairs and the warm lighting, at Marcus and Janet and the other staff members who were still hovering nearby with concerned expressions. "Until then, you're my guest," he said. "The airport has sleeping facilities for flight crews who get stranded. They're comfortable and private. You can shower, rest, eat real meals. Consider it part of your employment package, housing assistance while you transition to permanent arrangements." Emma's smile faltered slightly. "I don't want you to think. I don't think anything except that you deserve basic human comfort," Alexander said gently. "No strings, no expectations, just kindness, which you said yourself was more valuable than money." Emma nodded slowly, and Alexander could see her processing this, weighing risks and benefits, with the caution of someone who'd learned to be suspicious of good fortune. "All right," she said finally. "Thank you." Marcus stepped forward. "I can show you to the crew quarters whenever you're ready," he offered. Emma gathered her newspapers and few possessions, then paused. "Alexander," she said, and hearing his name in her voice sent an unexpected warmth through his chest. "Thank you for seeing me as a person instead of a problem." "Thank you," he replied, "for reminding me what it means to be human." As Marcus led Emma away toward the crew quarters, Alexander remained in the terminal, staring out at the storm. In the space of a few hours, his entire perspective had shifted. The quarterly reports and board meetings that had seemed so important that morning now felt trivial compared to the simple act of connecting with another human being in need. He pulled out his phone and began making calls. If he was going to help Emma rebuild her life, he was going to do it right. By morning, He would have identified potential positions within his companies, vetted housing options, and put together a transition plan that would give her the opportunity she deserved. But more than that, he knew that this encounter had changed something fundamental inside him. Emma had challenged him to see beyond his wealth and position, to recognize his responsibility, not just to generate profits, but to use his resources to make a real difference in individual lives. The storm raged on outside, but inside the terminal something new was beginning. A partnership, perhaps. A friendship, maybe. Or something else entirely. Something that neither Alexander nor Emma could have anticipated when she'd first curled up in that corner chair with nothing but newspapers for warmth. Alexander smiled as he headed back to his office, already planning the phone calls he would make, the arrangements he would put in place. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight had brought something far more valuable. The beginning of a connection that would change both their lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The blizzard that had trapped Emma in his airport had also freed something in Alexander that he hadn't even realized was imprisoned, and that, he thought, was the most valuable discovery of all. The morning light filtering through the terminal windows was soft and forgiving, nothing like the harsh fluorescent brightness Emma had grown accustomed to in her months of irregular shelter-seeking. She woke slowly in the crew quarters, momentarily disoriented by the comfort of an actual bed, clean sheets, and the absence of the constant vigilance that had become second nature to her survival. For a moment, she allowed herself to simply lie still and absorb the sensation of safety. The storm had passed sometime during the night, leaving behind a world transformed by snow, but also by possibility. Through the small window of her temporary room, she could see airport crews working to clear the runways, their orange vests bright against the white landscape. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Emma?" Janet's voice was gentle, cautious. "I've brought some clothes and toiletries, if you'd like them." Emma sat up, automatically smoothing her hair, then remembered that there was no one here she needed to impress or placate. "Come in," she called. Janet entered, carrying a small suitcase and wearing the kind of warm smile that reminded Emma of her third-grade teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, who had always made sure the kids from struggling families had lunch money and winter coats. "Mr. Hartwell asked me to put together some things that might fit you. I have a daughter about your size, so I took my best guess." Emma accepted the suitcase with gratitude that felt too large for words. "Thank you. You've all been so kind." "Kindness isn't something you should have to be grateful for," Janet said, echoing Alexander's words from the night before. "It should be a given." After Janet left, Emma explored the contents of the suitcase with the wonder of someone who had forgotten what it was like to have choices about clothing. There were jeans that looked new, soft sweaters in colors that complemented her complexion, underwear still in packages, and toiletries that smelled like lavender and possibility. The shower was a revelation. Emma stood under the hot water until her skin was pink and her muscles had unknotted, washing away not just 8 months of irregular hygiene, but also some of the psychological armor she'd built up to survive. With each layer of grime that swirled down the drain, she felt herself remembering who she used to be, not just physically, but emotionally and intellectually. When she emerged from the bathroom, dressed in clean clothes that fit properly, she caught sight of herself in the mirror and stopped short. The woman looking back at her was someone she'd almost forgotten. Emma Sullivan, elementary school teacher, lover of children's literature and hopeless romantic movies, someone who believed in the power of education to change lives. She'd thought that woman was gone, erased by months of humiliation and desperation. But apparently, she'd just been waiting underneath all the protective layers, ready to emerge when safety and kindness made it possible. A second knock interrupted her reflection. "Emma, it's Alexander. May I come in?" Emma's pulse quickened at the sound of his voice, though she couldn't quite identify why. "Of course." Alexander entered, carrying a tray with coffee, fresh fruit, and what appeared to be homemade muffins. He stopped when he saw her, and something in his expression made Emma acutely aware of the transformation that had taken place. "You look," he began, then seemed to catch himself. "That is, I hope you slept well." "Like the dead." Emma said, accepting the coffee gratefully. I'd forgotten what it felt like to sleep without listening for footsteps or voices, without planning escape routes. She realized how that sounded and added quickly, I mean, you don't have to explain, Alexander said gently. I can't imagine what the last 8 months have been like for you. Emma studied his face as she sipped her coffee. There was something different about him this morning, too, though she couldn't put her finger on what it was. He seemed less guarded, more present somehow, as if the conversation they'd shared in the storm had shifted something fundamental in his perspective. Have you given any thought to what kind of position might interest you? Alexander asked, settling into the chair across from her small table. Emma had been thinking about little else since she'd woken up. Actually, yes, you mentioned education and logistics companies. I've been wondering if there might be opportunities in corporate training or curriculum development. My background is in elementary education, but I have experience developing learning programs, working with diverse populations, assessing educational outcomes. Alexander's expression lit up with genuine interest. That's perfect, actually. We acquired an educational consulting firm last year, Harrison Learning Solutions. They develop training programs for corporations, everything from leadership development to technical skills. They've been looking for someone with hands-on teaching experience to lead their curriculum design team. What would that involve? Emma asked, trying to keep the hope from her voice. Working with corporate clients to assess their training needs, developing customized educational programs, overseeing implementation and measuring outcomes. It's exactly the kind of work that would utilize your background in education while giving you experience in the corporate world. Emma felt something unfurl in her chest. Excitement, anticipation, the thrill of intellectual challenge that she'd missed desperately during her months of simple survival. It sounds perfect, she said, but I have to ask, is this a real position that was already available, or are you creating something for me? Alexander smiled, and Emma realized she was beginning to recognize the difference between his professional smile and his genuine one. This was definitely the latter. It's a real position. They've been trying to fill it for 3 months. The salary is competitive, the benefits are excellent, and if you're as good as I suspect you are, there's significant room for advancement. How can you be sure I'm good at anything? You've known me for less than 24 hours. Because, Alexander said, leaning forward slightly, in the space of one conversation you demonstrated more insight into human nature, leadership, and social responsibility than most of the MBA graduates I interview. Because you've survived 8 months of homelessness without losing your dignity, your intelligence, or your basic human decency. Because you didn't ask me for money or try to manipulate my emotions. You asked for an opportunity to earn your way back to independence. Emma felt her cheeks warm at the admiration in his voice. Those are survival skills, not job qualifications. The best job qualifications often are survival skills, Alexander said. The ability to adapt, to problem solve under pressure, to maintain your core values when everything else is stripped away. Those are the qualities that make exceptional employees and leaders. Emma considered this, sipping her coffee and studying Alexander's face. There was sincerity there, but also something else, a kind of intensity that made her think he was as invested in this opportunity as she was, though for different reasons. Okay, she said finally, I'd like to interview for the position. Excellent. I'll set up a meeting with Sarah Harrison, the company president, for later this week. That will give you time to settle into housing and prepare. About the housing, Emma said carefully, I meant what I said last night about paying market rate. Alexander pulled out his phone and showed her a listing. I own a property management company that maintains several apartment buildings throughout the city. This is a 1-bedroom in Cambridge, about 20 minutes from the Harrison Learning Solutions office. The rent is $1,500 a month, which should be well within your salary range. Emma looked at the photos, a bright, clean apartment with hardwood floors and large windows. It was exactly the kind of place she would have chosen for herself in her previous life, and more luxury than she dared hope for in her current circumstances. It's beautiful, she said, but how do I know this is really market rate and not some kind of subsidized charity? Alexander turned his phone so she could see the screen. Here are comparable units in the same neighborhood, he said, scrolling through listings. As you can see, we're actually on the low end of the range, but that's because my company prioritizes stable, long-term tenants over maximum profit. Emma examined the listings, confirming that Alexander was telling the truth. The rent he was offering was indeed competitive for the area. All right, she said. I'd like to see it. We can go this morning if you'd like. And Emma? Alexander's voice became more serious. I want you to know that none of this is contingent on anything other than your professional qualifications. The job interview will be conducted by Sarah Harrison, not by me. If she doesn't think you're right for the position, you won't get it, regardless of how I feel about your potential. And the apartment is yours, regardless of whether you get the job, as long as you can make the rent payments. Emma felt something tighten in her throat. Gratitude, yes, but also a kind of disbelief that such straightforward kindness could exist in the world. Why are you doing this? She asked, and please don't tell me it's just because it's the right thing to do. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the snow-covered landscape. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful, as if he were working out the answer as he gave it. I've been thinking about that all night, he said, and I think it's because you reminded me of something I'd forgotten. When I was building my first company, when I was young and hungry and working 18-hour days, I used to think about the kind of leader I wanted to be, the kind of company I wanted to build. I had all these idealistic notions about using business as a force for good, about taking care of people, about wealth as responsibility rather than privilege. He paused, running a hand through his hair. Somewhere along the way, I lost that. I got caught up in the game, the acquisitions, the profit margins, the board meetings. I started measuring success in stock prices and market share instead of human impact. I became exactly the kind of wealthy executive I used to criticize. Emma watched his face as he spoke, seeing the genuine regret there. And meeting me changed that? Meeting you reminded me who I used to be, Alexander said, and who I still could be, if I choose to be. You asked me last night what really matters, and I realized I'd stopped asking myself that question. I'd stopped thinking about individual human stories in favor of statistical abstracts. Emma felt something shift in her understanding of this man. He wasn't helping her out of pity or guilt, though those emotions probably played a role. He was helping her because she'd inadvertently given him a gift, a reminder of his own values, a chance to reconnect with the idealistic young man he'd once been. So I'm your redemption project? Emma asked, but there was no bitterness in her voice, only curiosity. Alexander looked at her sharply. No, he said firmly. You're not a project at all. You're a person with talent and intelligence who deserves an opportunity to rebuild her life. The fact that helping you also helps me remember who I want to be. That's just a fortunate side effect. Emma nodded slowly, accepting this explanation. It felt honest in a way that simple altruism wouldn't have. People rarely acted from purely selfless motives, and she appreciated Alexander's willingness to acknowledge the complexity of his own motivations. All right, she said. Let's go look at this apartment. The drive through the city was surreal for Emma, who had become accustomed to experiencing Boston from the perspective of bus stops, subway platforms, and public spaces where she could sit without drawing attention. Seeing it from the passenger seat of Alexander's luxury sedan, warm, comfortable, with someone who actually wanted her company, felt like emerging from a parallel universe. Alexander pointed out landmarks and neighborhoods as they drove, but Emma found herself studying his profile instead of the scenery. In daylight, without the drama of the storm and the harsh terminal lighting, she could see him more clearly. He was handsome in the way of men who had always been taken care of. Good bone structure, clear skin, the kind of physical confidence that came from excellent health care and regular exercise. But there were lines around his eyes that spoke of stress, and a tension in his shoulders that suggested the weight of significant responsibility. Have you always lived in Boston? Emma asked. Born and raised, Alexander replied. My father started the company when I was a kid. I grew up thinking everyone's dad owned airplanes and had meetings in conference rooms bigger than most people's houses. That must have been strange, Emma said, growing up with that kind of wealth. Alexander glanced at her, seeming to gauge whether she was genuinely curious or just making conversation. It was isolating, he said finally. Private schools, private clubs, vacations to places where we only interacted with other wealthy families. I didn't really understand how most people lived until I went to college. Is that where you developed your idealistic notions about business? Partially, Alexander said, but mostly it was meeting people like my roommate, whose family had lost their farm to medical debt, or my girlfriend junior year, whose mother worked 3 jobs to put her through school. I started to understand that my father's success came with responsibilities beyond just making more money. Emma heard something in his voice. Old pain, perhaps, or regret. Your father didn't agree? My father believed that business was business and charity was charity, and never the two should meet, Alexander said. He thought my ideas about corporate social responsibility were naive and potentially damaging to shareholder value. What changed your mind? About following those idealistic notions, I mean. Alexander pulled into the parking lot of a brick apartment building with large windows and well-maintained landscaping. He turned off the engine but didn't immediately get out of the car. He died, Alexander said quietly. Massive heart attack when I was 31. Suddenly I was running a multi-billion-dollar company, and I was so focused on proving I could do it, on maintaining the growth trajectory he'd established, that I forgot everything I'd planned to do differently. Emma felt a surge of empathy for the young man he'd been, thrust into enormous responsibility while grieving, trying to honor his father's legacy while managing his own vision for the future. That must have been incredibly difficult. It was, Alexander said, and by the time I felt stable enough to start implementing changes, I'd gotten comfortable with the status quo. It's easier to write charity checks than to fundamentally examine how your business practices affect individual lives. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching people navigate the snowy sidewalks outside. Emma found herself thinking about the complexity of moral choices, how circumstances could push even well-intentioned people away from their values. For what it's worth, she said finally, I think it's never too late to become the person you wanted to be. Alexander turned to look at her, and something in his expression made Emma's breath catch. There was gratitude there, yes, but also something deeper, a kind of recognition, as if he were seeing her not just as someone to help, but as someone who could help him in return. Thank you, he said quietly. I needed to hear that. The apartment exceeded Emma's expectations. It was bright and spacious, with built-in bookshelves that made her think immediately of all the books she'd had to abandon when she'd lost her previous life. The kitchen was small, but functional, and the bedroom had large windows that filled the space with natural light. The building has a laundry room in the basement, and there's a small garden in the back that tenants can use, the property manager explained as they toured the space. Heat and hot water are included in the rent. Emma walked through the room slowly, imagining herself living here, cooking meals, reading in the window seat, waking up in a place that belonged to her. After 8 months of temporary spaces and constant uncertainty, the idea of having her own key, her own mailbox, her own address, felt almost impossibly luxurious. I'll take it, she said, turning to Alexander with a smile that felt like it came from some deep place inside her that had been dormant for months. Excellent, the property manager said. I'll draw up the lease agreement. When would you like to move in? Emma looked at Alexander, suddenly uncertain. I don't have first month's rent or a security deposit, she admitted. Or any possessions to move, for that matter. The company has a program for employees who are relocating, Alexander said smoothly. We can advance you the deposit and first month's rent to be deducted from your first few paychecks. And there are furnished units available if you prefer not to shop for furniture immediately. Emma felt that familiar surge of gratitude mixed with wariness. Is that a real program or something you're creating for me? It's a real program, Alexander assured her. We relocate employees fairly regularly for various positions. The HR department has standard procedures for housing assistance. The property manager nodded confirmation. We work with several large employers in the city. It's a common arrangement. Emma felt some of her tension ease. All right then. Yes, I'd like to move in as soon as possible. I can have the paperwork ready by this afternoon, the property manager said. You could have keys by tomorrow morning. As they drove back toward the airport, Emma found herself watching the city with new eyes. Instead of scanning for safe places to rest or public bathrooms or spots where she could sit without attracting attention, she was looking at her new neighborhood, coffee shops where she might become a regular, a bookstore where she could browse without feeling like she had to buy something to justify her presence, a life where she could be a participant instead of just a survivor. "How are you feeling?" Alexander asked as they waited at a red light. Emma considered the question seriously. "Scared," she said finally, "and excited, and grateful, and terrified that I'm going to mess this up somehow." "You won't mess it up," Alexander said with quiet confidence. "How can you be so sure?" "Because you've already survived something that would have broken most people," Alexander said. "Everything from here on out is going to be easier than what you've already endured." Emma hoped he was right, but she'd learned not to take anything for granted. Still, for the first time in 8 months, she found herself looking forward to the future instead of just trying to survive the present. "Alexander," she said as they pulled into the airport parking garage, "I want you to know that this isn't just about the job and the apartment. Last night, when you sat down and talked to me like I was a person instead of a problem, that meant more to me than you'll probably ever understand." Alexander turned off the engine and looked at her, and Emma was surprised by the intensity in his expression. "It meant something to me too," he said. "More than you'll probably ever understand." There was something in the air between them, a tension that Emma couldn't quite identify. It wasn't sexual exactly, though there was an element of that. It was more like recognition, two people who had been lost in different ways, finding something in each other that they hadn't known they were looking for. "What happens now?" Emma asked. "Now you prepare for your interview," Alexander said. "And I try to figure out how to run a company in a way that would make both my younger self and my father proud." "That sounds like a challenging balance." "The best challenges usually are," Alexander said, "but I think I'm ready for it now, thanks to you." Emma felt that unfamiliar warmth in her chest again, the sense that she was part of something larger than her own survival. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. For seeing me, for helping me, for giving me a chance to help you too." As they walked back into the airport together, Emma realized that the storm that had brought them together had done more than just clear the skies. It had cleared away the barriers that had kept both of them isolated, her by circumstance, him by choice. And, in that clearing, something new was beginning to grow. She didn't know what it was yet, or where it might lead. But for the first time in 8 months, Emma Sullivan was excited to find out. 3 weeks later, Emma stood in front of the mirror in her new apartment, adjusting the blazer she'd bought for her first major presentation as head of curriculum design for Harrison Learning Solutions. The job had been everything Alexander had promised: challenging, rewarding, and absolutely perfect for her combination of teaching experience and educational innovation. Sarah Harrison had hired her on the spot after a 2-hour interview that had felt more like an energizing brainstorming session than an interrogation. The position came with a salary that made the apartment rent comfortable rather than a stretch, health insurance that felt like an impossible luxury after months without medical care, and colleagues who valued her insights and experience. But more than the professional success, it was the simple fact of belonging somewhere that transformed Emma's daily existence. She had a routine now: morning coffee while reading the news, a commute that took her through parts of the city she was beginning to know intimately, work that engaged her mind and creativity, evenings spent reading or cooking, or simply enjoying the profound pleasure of being alone in a space that was entirely her own. The presentation she was preparing for today was for Hartwell International's senior leadership team, including Alexander. It would be the first time she'd seen him since her second day at Harrison Learning Solutions, when he'd stopped by to check on how she was settling in. They'd had coffee in the break room, talked about her initial projects, and carefully avoided the intensity that had crackled between them during her first days of transition. Emma had been grateful for the distance, actually. She'd needed time to establish her professional identity separate from the circumstances of how she'd met Alexander. She'd needed to prove to herself and her colleagues that she'd earned her position through merit, not through a billionaire's pity. And she'd needed to figure out what her feelings toward Alexander actually were, underneath the gratitude and the complicated dynamics of their first encounter. Now, 3 weeks into her new life, she felt ready to see him again. Not as a homeless woman accepting charity, but as a professional colleague with valuable expertise and hard-won insights into organizational development and human potential. The presentation was on creating trauma-informed workplace training programs, a proposal Emma had developed after realizing how many employees across all levels of organizations had experienced various forms of personal crisis, loss, or hardship that affected their ability to perform and connect with colleagues. It was work that came directly from her own experience, but approached with the analytical rigor of her educational background and the innovative thinking that had made her successful at Harrison Learning Solutions. She was proud of it in a way she hadn't been proud of anything in almost a year. Emma arrived at Hartwell International's headquarters 20 minutes early, wanting time to familiarize herself with the presentation space and calm her nerves. The building was impressive, 40 stories of glass and steel overlooking Boston Harbor, but she found herself thinking about the airport terminal where she'd first met Alexander and how much her perspective had shifted since that night. Then, she'd been focused on simple survival. Now, she was focused on contribution, how she could use her skills and experience to help other people navigate professional challenges and personal growth. The transformation felt miraculous, even to her. "Emma?" Alexander's voice behind her made her turn, and she was struck by how different he looked in his corporate environment. Still handsome, still carrying himself with quiet authority, but somehow more relaxed than he'd been during those intense early conversations. "Hello, Alexander," she said, extending her hand for a professional handshake. "Thank you for including me in today's presentation." He took her hand, and Emma felt that familiar spark of connection, though it was tempered now by mutual respect rather than the desperate circumstances of their first meeting. "Thank you for developing what I'm told is a groundbreaking training proposal," Alexander replied. "Sarah speaks very highly of your work." They walked toward the conference room together, and Emma found herself noticing details about Alexander that she'd missed before. The way he greeted security guards and receptionists by name, the fact that he stopped to ask a maintenance worker about his daughter's college applications, the genuine interest he showed in a junior executive's presentation outline as they passed in the hallway. "You've made some changes," Emma observed as they waited for the elevator. Alexander glanced at her, clearly understanding that she wasn't talking about his appearance. "I've been trying to remember what kind of leader I wanted to be," he said. "It turns out it's easier than I thought, once you start paying attention to individual people instead of just aggregate numbers." The elevator arrived, and as they rode to the 40th floor, Emma found herself thinking about the complexity of human transformation. Alexander had the resources to change his approach to leadership, but he needed a reminder of his own values to actually implement those changes. She'd had the skills and experience to rebuild her professional life, but she'd needed an opportunity to demonstrate those capabilities. "How are you finding the apartment?" Alexander asked as they stepped off the elevator. "Perfect," Emma said honestly. "I wake up every morning and can't quite believe it's mine. Thank you for making that possible." "You made it possible," Alexander said firmly. "I just provided information about available resources." Emma smiled at his insistence on framing her success as her own achievement. It was one of the things she'd come to appreciate about him, his ability to help people without diminishing their agency or dignity in the process. The conference room was impressive. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor, a polished table that could seat 20 people, technology that would allow her presentation to be shared simultaneously with Hartwell International offices around the world. Emma had presented to corporate audiences before, but never with stakes that felt quite so personal. As the senior leadership team filed in, Emma recognized several faces from business magazines and newspaper profiles. These were people who made decisions affecting thousands of employees and millions of customers. The fact that they were taking time to consider her ideas about trauma-informed workplace practices felt both thrilling and intimidating. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander said as the meeting began, "I'm pleased to introduce Emma Sullivan from Harrison Learning Solutions. Emma has developed a training proposal that I believe could significantly impact how we think about employee development and organizational culture." "Emma?" Emma stood, feeling the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with engaging an audience on a subject she cared deeply about. Thank you, Alexander. I'm here today to talk about something that affects every organization but is rarely addressed directly: the impact of personal trauma and crisis on workplace performance and relationship building. She clicked to her first slide, which showed statistics about the prevalence of various forms of trauma and hardship across all demographic groups. These numbers represent experiences that people bring with them to work every day: job loss, medical crises, family deaths, financial hardship, relationship breakups, housing instability. Traditional workplace training assumes that employees can simply compartmentalize these experiences, but research shows that's neither realistic nor effective. Emma moved through her presentation with growing confidence, explaining how trauma-informed practices can improve everything from employee retention to customer service to innovation and creativity. She shared case studies from organizations that had implemented similar programs and data showing measurable improvements in performance and job satisfaction. But it was when she reached the section on specific implementation strategies that Emma felt the room's attention truly focus. These weren't abstract concepts. They were practical, actionable approaches that could be customized for different types of organizations and employee populations. The key insight, Emma said, is that helping employees build resilience and emotional intelligence isn't just good for individuals, it's good for business. People who feel supported through personal challenges are more likely to be engaged, creative, and committed to organizational success. One of the senior executives raised her hand. "This is fascinating work, Ms. Sullivan, but I have to ask, how do you know these approaches actually work? What's your evidence base beyond the external research?" Emma had been expecting this question, and she took a deep breath before answering. "My evidence base includes 8 months of personal experience with trauma and crisis, and 3 weeks of experience with trauma-informed support and opportunity. I can tell you from direct observation that people are capable of remarkable resilience and contribution when they're given appropriate resources and treated with dignity." The room was completely quiet, and Emma could feel the weight of 20 sets of eyes studying her. She'd made a calculated decision to reference her own experience, knowing it would either enhance her credibility or undermine it entirely. "Can you elaborate on that?" Alexander asked gently, and Emma realized he was giving her an opportunity to contextualize her statement, rather than leaving it hanging mysteriously. "I became homeless 8 months ago due to financial fraud committed by my former fiancé," Emma said matter-of-factly. "I lost my job, my housing, my savings, and my professional identity. For 8 months, I lived without stable shelter, income, or basic security. 3 weeks ago, I was given an opportunity to demonstrate my professional capabilities, and today, I'm presenting to this leadership team." Emma paused, looking around the room at expressions that ranged from surprise to admiration to discomfort. "That transformation didn't happen because I suddenly became more capable or intelligent. It happened because someone recognized that my circumstances didn't define my potential and provided trauma-informed support that allowed me to access and demonstrate my existing skills." The senior executive who had asked the original question leaned forward. "And you believe that kind of transformation is possible for other employees who may be dealing with personal crises?" "I believe it's not only possible but inevitable, given appropriate support," Emma said. "Most people don't need to be fixed or saved. They need to be seen, supported, and given opportunities to contribute. The training programs I'm proposing are designed to help managers and colleagues provide that kind of environment." For the next hour, Emma fielded questions and discussed implementation strategies with a group of executives who seemed genuinely engaged with her ideas. She found herself thinking about how surreal this was. 3 weeks ago, she'd been sleeping in airport terminals and surviving on discarded food. Now she was advising corporate leaders on organizational development strategy. When the presentation ended, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Several executives requested follow-up meetings to discuss implementation in their specific divisions. The head of human resources wanted to explore pilot programs. The chief financial officer asked for detailed cost-benefit analyses. As the room cleared, Alexander remained behind, and Emma found herself alone with him for the first time since her first week at Harrison Learning Solutions. "That was remarkable," Alexander said, and the admiration in his voice made Emma's cheeks warm. "You didn't just present a training program. You shared a vision for how organizations can honor human dignity while achieving business objectives." "It felt important," Emma said. "The work, I mean. Not just for me, but for everyone who gets overlooked or dismissed because of temporary circumstances." Alexander moved closer, and Emma was suddenly aware of the energy between them, the same intensity she'd felt that first night, but transformed by mutual respect and shared purpose rather than desperation and charity. "Emma," Alexander said quietly, "I want you to know that what you shared today about your own experience, that took enormous courage." "It felt like the right thing to do," Emma said. "If I'm going to ask people to be vulnerable and honest about the challenges employees face, I need to model that vulnerability myself." Alexander nodded, and Emma could see him processing the implications of her words. "You've given me a lot to think about," he said. "About leadership, about responsibility, about the kind of company I want this to be." "Good," Emma said with a smile. "That was sort of the point." They stood looking at each other for a moment, and Emma felt the air between them charged with possibility. Not just professional possibility, though that was certainly part of it. Something more personal, more complex, more connected to the journey they'd both taken over the past 3 weeks. "Emma," Alexander said, and there was something different in his voice now, less formal, more personal. "Would you like to have dinner? Not a business dinner," he added quickly. "A personal dinner. 2 people who have discovered they enjoy each other's company and would like to explore that further." Emma felt her heart rate quicken, but not with the anxiety she'd experienced so often over the past months. This was anticipation, excitement, the thrill of possibility that she'd almost forgotten existed. "I'd like that very much," she said, "but I have a condition." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Another condition?" Emma laughed, remembering her conditions about the job and apartment. "I pay for my own meal," she said. "I'm not interested in being rescued or taken care of. I'm interested in being an equal participant in whatever this might become." Alexander's smile was brilliant, transforming his entire face. "Deal," he said, "though I reserve the right to argue about dessert." "We'll negotiate when we get there," Emma said, and realized she was flirting. Actually flirting, like a normal person with a normal life who could afford to think about romance and possibility and shared desserts. As they walked out of the conference room together, Emma caught sight of their reflection in the darkened windows overlooking the harbor. They looked like what they were, 2 professionals who had found something meaningful in each other, both personally and in their shared commitment to using resources and opportunities to make a positive difference in other people's lives. It was exactly what Emma had dreamed of during those long months of survival mode, though she hadn't dared believe it was actually possible. Not just stability and security, but purpose and connection, and the kind of partnership that could amplify both their individual impacts. The blizzard that had brought them together had long since melted, leaving behind clear skies and solid ground. And for the first time since her world had collapsed 8 months ago, Emma Sullivan was excited to see what kind of life she could build on that foundation. Outside the windows of Hartwell International, Boston Harbor sparkled in the late afternoon sun, and Emma found herself thinking that even the most devastating storms eventually gave way to beautiful weather. The key was learning to recognize the difference between temporary turbulence and permanent damage, and having the courage to keep building even when the forecast looked uncertain. She looked at Alexander, walking beside her with an expression that suggested he was thinking along similar lines, and realized that some of the best things in life began with unexpected encounters during the worst possible circumstances. The trick was being open enough to recognize opportunity when it appeared, even when it came disguised as crisis. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new possibilities. But tonight, Emma Sullivan would have dinner with a man who had seen her at her lowest point and chosen to offer not just charity but opportunity. A man who had allowed her own story of resilience to remind him of his own capacity for meaningful leadership. It was a beginning, not an ending. And after 8 months of just trying to survive each day, Emma was finally ready to start building a future worth celebrating. The story that would make headlines wasn't just about a billionaire helping a homeless woman, though that was certainly part of it. It was about two people discovering that individual transformation was possible, but collective transformation was even more powerful. It was about the recognition that everyone has something valuable to contribute, regardless of their current circumstances. And it was about the revolutionary idea that business success and human dignity were not only compatible, but mutually reinforcing. In the months and years that followed, Hartwell International would become known for its innovative employee support programs and trauma-informed workplace practices. Harrison Learning Solutions would expand nationwide, helping organizations across the country implement similar approaches. And Emma Sullivan would become a nationally recognized expert on resilience, recovery, and the untapped potential that exists in every human being. But all of that started with a blizzard, an airport terminal, and two people who were brave enough to see beyond surface circumstances to the deeper possibilities that existed when kindness met opportunity and when individual healing became the foundation for collective transformation. As they stepped out into the crisp Boston afternoon, Emma found herself smiling at the thought that sometimes the most important headlines were written not in newspapers, but in the quiet moments when people chose to treat each other with dignity and respect. Those were the stories that changed lives, one conversation at a time. And this was only the beginning of theirs.